to feel your presence and to be transformed by what you have to say. Do this, whether through me or in spite of me. For this we pray. Amen. The parable of the sheep and the goats can be a hard parable to hear. It's a story about the coming judgment of the Christians. Not just the Christians and non-Christians, but just the Christians. And in this story, we hear that some of these believers, these men and women who dedicated their lives to following Christ, some of them are separated and placed on Christ's left hand and sent off into the eternal punishment. And some get to go on to eternal life. And the problem with this story is that when we hear it, sometimes it makes us uncomfortable. It causes us to stir in our seats a little bit, and we begin to worry about whether we are one of the goats or whether we are one of the sheep, especially if we get too far into the details and the absolutes in the story. If we begin to look at the fact that Jesus says to the goats, to the extent that you didn't do one of these things, even to one of the least of these, you didn't do it to me. And we may begin to worry about, was there a time that I missed someone? And therefore I'm going to not end up where I thought I was headed. Or perhaps we look at the other side and think, well, maybe I haven't done it for everyone. And if I haven't done it for everyone, then I qualified to be a sheep. And it just kind of gets us into this place where we might be a little uncomfortable. The good news, though, is that Jesus rarely deals in absolutes. He is unlike the Pharisees in that there is no real hard or fast rule, and anything that we can examine from his life, that there's always kind of this grace, this level of forgiveness. And so, if we have missed one person in our lives and we failed to feed one hungry person that we may have walked by, it's probably not as disastrous as we might think. But what the story does get at is kind of the intention of our hearts and how we see the world. You see, the sheep were those who followed Christ, those who tried to live like Christ. They not only saw him as their Lord, they not only acknowledged that he existed, that he was God, that he was in charge of their lives, that he was the judge of righteousness, but they looked at how he lived, and they did the same. They walked the paths that he walked. And if we look at Jesus' life, if we look at what the gospel tells us, we'll see stories of the 5,000 and the 4,000 and the 7,000 and all of these where Jesus is feeding these people who are hungry. We see stories of Paul and Peter and others visiting the prisons. Jesus himself being imprisoned for the sake of the gospel right before his crucifixion. We see Jesus healing the sick, offering the living water to the woman at the well. We hear Jesus teach about if a man asks you for your coat, give him your shirt as well. The idea of clothing those who may not have it. We hear stories of Jesus opening up his doors to everyone, the doors to the kingdom of heaven, in fact, and stories of him sending the disciples out to go and visit people, and if the people accept them into their house, then he says to bless their house and know that God is with them always. But if they reject you, to go ahead and shake the sand from your sandals and the dust from your feet and leave them behind. These stories throughout the gospel of who Jesus is are all kind of encapsulated here in this. and we hear that the people who took these stories to heart, the people who began to live them out, are separated and allowed to enter the kingdom of heaven. You see, the kingdom of heaven is a place that is built on community and relationship, a place that is built out of love and care for one another. The people who enter into the kingdom of heaven are people who desire to be that kind of person. They desire to care for others. They desire to no longer think about themselves and their own needs, but rather to think about the needs of others and trust that other people will think about them and care for them as well. The people who enter into the kingdom of heaven are very much like sheep. They are willing to put their heads down and to be a part of the group and trust that the group will lead them in the right direction. And they follow Christ through the gates and into his kingdom. And so these sheep, they are those who feed the hungry. They are those who in their hearts, they see the thirsty and they see the opportunity to give someone something to drink, and they get to experience Jesus' presence in that moment. That as Jesus said, even to the extent you did it, the least of these you did it to me, it is these people, these sheep, who can see God in all persons and who seek to be in God's presence and to serve God by serving God in that person. They are people that can walk into a prison and see a 350-pound man who can bench press 600 pounds, who has tattoos all over his body and a shaved head, who was arrested and convicted of a triple homicide and assault, aggravated assault, and all of these things, and they can see this person who has done this great evil, and yet still managed to see Christ in them and go to them and let them know that they are not forgotten, and that just because they have messed up in their lives, just because they've done things wrong, doesn't mean that they aren't loved or worthy of love. The sheep build up a community and relationships and share love even when it's hard. Even when maybe that prisoner that you go and visit is someone who wronged you personally or a family member of yours. That they're willing to house the stranger even when that stranger may look a little rough. May look a little like life hasn't treated them so well. They find a place to offer them shelter. And then the sheep get to enter into the kingdom of heaven because the sheep are the ones that built it all along. That the kingdom and the place that the sheep desire to go, the hope that they have for the future is one and the same with the kingdom of heaven. The goats, on the other hand, are believers who decided that they could do it their own way. That Christianity was all about their faith and their personal walk. There are people who may have thought that some kind of moral righteousness would get them into the kingdom of heaven, and who acted more like Pharisees rather than followers of Christ, and they didn't have concern for others. Instead, they were concerned about, what must I do? What must I be to get into the kingdom of heaven? And there are people who build up their lives and their faith in an isolation. And there are people who build their own futures, who build their own destination, that this eternal punishment and this fire is not is not something that God just decided to throw them into. It instead is the place that they chose to be, a place that because of how they chose to live, how they saw their faith and how they tried to do everything for themselves, that they failed to build those relationships and those communities of support and care. That they failed to allow God to come into their lives and change them in any meaningful way. And they're surprised, shocked, when they find out that Christ is not pleased with all the work that they may have done on themselves. And they're shocked that Jesus is telling them that, you didn't do things the way I did them. And now you're not coming with me. But there should be no shock. I think the best news in the story, though, is that Jesus doesn't arbitrarily decide which side you're on. Each of us gets to choose which side we're going to be on. We get to choose how we're going to live our lives and how we're going to focus. Are we going to focus our lives on being self-righteous and these high moral individuals, or are we going to focus our lives on living them for other people? Are we going to focus on doing things our own way? Or are we going to be submissive enough to follow Jesus where he would lead us, even when that may be scary or difficult? Can we be a people that trust God to protect us with his rod and his staff and to lead us to still waters? Or are we going to be a people that are going to trust in the horns on our own head and prepare to headbutt anything and everything that stands in our way? The idea of sheep and goats, the choice of using these two animals is a perfect example of a Christian follower and a Christian who is a defiant objector. That both believe in God, and yet some still insist that God can be, and Christ can be, and faith can be done on their terms, rather than willingly accepting that God may be calling us in a different direction. And the question is which side do you want to be on? When Christ sits in his judgment seat and you are gathered there with all of your brothers and sisters, do you want to be the side that moves as a community together into the sheep and goes off into the eternal kingdom and gets to see the fulfillment of all of your hopes and dreams that you have lived throughout your life, this idea of being able to care for others without concern for yourself, because that's the kingdom that you have already been building here and now? Or are you a person that rather just step alone and wonder why no one else is willing to step with you? Why it is that it seems so isolated? Why Jesus never really seemed real? Why you never actually could see him in the world until this moment when he's sitting there on the throne? I hope that as a church we all choose to be sheep, that we choose to follow God and to truly change our lives and to live for others, to allow that part of ourselves that sits there and says, you need to take care of you, to be silenced, rather than indulging it, thinking that somehow Jesus will conform to our way of doing things. Amen.